But to address this question around centre politics, now, what does centre politics mean? It's bringing up the question of the political spectrum. And when we talk about the political spectrum, the most common terms that we hear people use is on the spectrum between left and right. And that's one of the most common mechanisms we use for distinguishing between various ideas, whether it's a left-wing type idea or a right-wing type idea. But the more you look at issues and the more you start to look at various political parties, you'll realize that the left-right system for describing things isn't nuanced enough. It's very, very simplistic, and it's, it really will end up where there's no place for people to really discuss and create distinction between various aspects of some very similar type issues. So the left-right system is not nuanced enough. Now, in recent years, we have groups like the politicalcompass.org, and that's one of the slides that I reference. They have used a 2-axis political spectrum, they have on the horizontal axis, the XY, economic left and right. And economic left would be represented ultimately by ideas like communism, and the right, complete free market principles in terms of how a society structures its economics. The second spectrum that they've brought into it now is the axis between authoritarian views versus libertarian, or how much emphasis we place on society determining what it is you should do versus personal freedom and the ability for people to express themselves on an individual basis. Now, I'm not sure if anyone can see the slides that I've put up.
On that note, Dahi, so let me know when you want to be on a slide. Let me know which slide to be on. One thing I do just want to mention, so I'm on the first slide now with the Australian election 2016. This strikes me as, so I'm not sure if this is, like, if Political Compass have produced this and endorsed it, but this strikes me as like a very opinionated diagram, as in, like, the Greens have, there's some libertarian ideas there, or like freedom-ish ideas, but there's also some crazy authoritarian ideas. Like, literally, we're going to make it illegal to, like, for anyone to run anything related to coal, like, either a coal mine or a coal-fired power station or things like that. And that's very anti-libertarian and anti-freedom. And so there's, like, this graph, I think, has an agenda in it, sort of thing. Like, Labour have plenty of left economic policies still. The Liberal and Nationals are not 90% to the right. Like, this gives the impression that there is so few policies they could adopt that would make them any more, right-wing or authoritarian. And that's just, I mean, it's anyway, yeah. So I guess I wanted to raise the issue about this graph. I definitely don't endorse it, but it's illustrative of the point, and that's why it's here, right?
Yes, exactly. I was going to get to that in that.
Oh, sorry, I jumped the gun.
Yeah, no, it's good. Political Compass use a set of analysis tools across a variety of issues with weightings associated with them, and then they pump in all of the policy positions that the various parties have, and then certain ones would have greater weighting than others, and the output is diagrams like we see below. Now, these diagrams don't represent an absolute truth in determining what these parties actually represent. The best thing that the diagrams like this can represent is the relative position that the parties have, of the relative position between the parties and how they might trend over time if you use the same analysis to measure how they are changing and adapting their policies over elections. Now, the point that I was looking to make in this particular slide is, if we just take this as an arbitrary reflection of the political landscape in Australia, what does the centre represent? Like, does the centre represent the centre of the political axis spectrum between left, right, libertarian, authoritarian, or does it represent the centre between where voters are assigning their votes? Like, does it represent somewhere between where Labour and Liberal currently are? In which case, that would mean that Australia would actually be somewhat of the centre in Australia would, by a lot of measures, be somewhat right-leaning. And that's an analysis that a number of writers have spoken about, that when we talk about the centre politics in Australia, what we're essentially doing is we're just talking about the space that exists between the two dominant narratives put forward by Labour and Liberal for how the government should function. It's not necessarily discussing things from a true objective centre position, which might lie outside that kind of that established government paradigm. So that's the first thing to take into account.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, there's something occurred to me there. Like, we talked about a few ways you can think about, this diagram of left, right, libertarian, authoritarian. Some of the things that I thought about just while you were saying that, and based off what I said before, right, is there are edges here that imply things by the nature of them being an edge. So, but there's certainly, I think in pretty much like most cases, you can come up with, even someone you'd put over on the edge, you could come up with policies that would be more extreme in a particular direction. And so things like, I guess, like, a free market thing is maybe like somewhere where you'd hit a limit, but like authoritarian, for example, I mean, there's plenty of, like, you can go beyond genocide as an argument there. So the nature of the edge biases the viewer. So then secondly, if you were to just extend this graph out, to just draw it out but leave everything where it is now, suddenly everyone looks incredibly centrist, which is sort of ridiculous, right? So what are these edges actually meaning? Are they just by comparison to all possible policies, or all policies that are actually being suggested by someone in a political arena, etc.? And then there's this idea about the center. Now, we sort of talked about this, like, you can analyze it from the point of view of the current, like, political climate and the current policies that are being suggested. But I think there's another way to look at the idea of, like, the center. And that is, the center is this, like, somewhat unknowable, objectively best policy. And each policy actually has its own graph. And so you can maybe make an argument about how these are like the averages of that or something like that. But if you look at each policy like that, and then what you can say is that, like, if we have an objectively best policy, not that we can necessarily know what it is, but if we have something like that, then you can say, the idea of being more and less relative in authoritarianism or libertarian or things like that, I think starts to make more sense. In that, because the best policy doesn't really, like, you can analyze it in terms of like a left-right type thing, except that it sort of implies that by putting everything on one graph, it implies that there is a spot that is correct to be in on this graph. And I don't think that's the case, especially when there's such a degree of variation within policies, which is something this graph doesn't even show, but could, right? It could quite easily show the spread of Green policies and Labour policies and Liberals and National, etc. I'm not exactly sure why CAT is on there, but you could show that spread, and it doesn't. Like, it's actually withholding information and misleading you in some ways.
I'm not sure that. I mean, I think that's part of the problem, though, Max. Is that and that's maybe this is where Dahi's sort of going with this. Is that you've got two axes there, and you are kind of limited insofar as if you want to graph every single policy, it becomes much more difficult to do, especially when you're talking about political organisations that can be fluid as well, and they're thinking. So I think that's part of the problem, is that, we are trying to fit people in to a little box that is on this on this two-axis chart. And I think maybe part of where we're thinking here is that the idea of being a centrist, I think you kind of alluded to this, is not so much about necessarily where you sit on that graph, but is a willingness to, I guess, excuse yourself from these concepts of left and right and start thinking objectively about policy without that concept of, like, tribalism and override. I mean, we're going to talk a little bit about political philosophies in a moment, and I think where that discussion is going to go is the idea that political philosophies are generally very encompassing, whereas you can, within one philosophy, find good ideas and bad ideas simultaneously.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I agree. I think this graph like actually demonstrates a lot of the problems with political stuff. One of the interesting points you made there was like the idea of a centrist being someone who's willing to like be outside the typical like stereotypes, I guess you'd say. And it's sort of funny thinking about it like that, because a centrist could then be all over the camp depending on the actual issue that's there.
Yes.
Which is what you'd expect from good policy anyway, is that it's not all going to be on one part of this graph.
That's right. Yeah.
So anyway, Dahi, sorry, I interrupted you there.
Yeah, no, all good. If we move on to the second slide, this just shows political compasses, the same axes and the same criteria applied to the various parties' policies between 2010 and 2016. And I think something interesting that can be discerned from this, one is the movement of the Greens relative to the other parties. And I think that's, I don't know how reflective that is of the actual truth, and how different how much their policies have actually modified over time to reflect that move towards the more libertarian axis. But one that I think that is really worth paying attention to is the dynamic between Labour and Liberal, and the two main parties, and how you would think that it serves Labour's best interest to be distancing themselves from their opponents. But we'll see when I get into one of the later slides about the media landscape that a lot of the time being too distant from your opponents can actually just expose you to weakness. And we see that like one of the big criticisms of the Labour Party, well, one of the criticisms that comes from within the Labour Party's membership base is that over time people feel that they are trending more towards the Liberal Party in some regards. And I would say that that's maybe somewhat a byproduct of the media landscape and the political spin doctoring required in order to ensure that they don't expose any vulnerabilities that can be taken advantage of by the media to make them look weak on certain issues. And so they want to actually position themselves as close to their opponents as possible on some issues, and then differentiate themselves just on minor points where they can bring that to the election.
Well, that's the idea of a wedge issue, right? Is that they're selecting a small number of things to turn the debate into, so that it's becomes something that's easy to manage, I guess.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking as well, should we go through the rest of these slides, or do we want to dig into the questions proper?
I'll just quickly close out the slides, and then we can.
So we're on the overall liberalism slide.
Yeah, and then this is just some work done by someone at sgriffian.wordpress. Because Vote Compass doesn't take into account any of the micro parties, we can be left with a somewhat vague view of like where the nuance of views and all of the different types of views that still exist in Australian society, where they exist on the spectrum. And so it's worth just paying attention to the fact that there are, a variety of micro parties out there with various positions that sit between the majors. So, and I think that go ahead, Max.
I was just going to say, one of the interesting things I noticed about this slide versus, and this was 2016, so the overall liberalism slide versus the last slide with from Politicompass is, and this is an interesting discrepancy between the two. The Liberals are plotted quite close to the top on the authoritarian graph, and the Greens quite about halfway down towards libertarianism. But then on the overall liberalism, which is, I'd say close enough to, liberalism and libertarianism are pretty similar in many ways, not necessarily philosophically, but in consequence. And the LNP are graphed at 0 here, so they're set at the 0 mark, and then everyone is graphed relative to them. The Greens are at 0.12 Like, and so that's like, this is in many ways meant to be, should be at least analogous to the vertical axis of the previous graphs, and yet we see something that's entirely different. And it's sort of interesting, right? I think it shows the, like, a lot of the either futility or implicit assumptions in the way people graph these things, and that those implicit assumptions or implicit explanations, I think, can be really dangerous because they're the stuff that we can't easily talk about. You know, like, what do I criticize about those? I mean, maybe we can if we did more research into how Politicompass works, but yeah, you sort of get what I mean there, I presume.
Yeah. And if you just want to skip to the last slide about the media landscape. And so this is some work that was done by user Politiqual on the Australia subreddit, where they just mapped out the various media outlets in Australia on two axes, between left and right, and also from high quality down to poor quality. And I think what's really interesting about this slide for me is when we look at who exists in the poor quality segment and who exists in the high quality segment, and the relative attention that's paid to each of them inside the normal discourse. And if you were to just look at social media, for example, and see which of these outlets is more likely to be shared by people, which of these outlets is used by the breakfast TV shows to establish what is the narrative that we're going to be talking about today. And we'll see that I think Australia very much kind of sits in the mixed quality leans right area. And so what does that actually mean for having pragmatic, sensible center discussions? Like, what outlets are doing that? Like, are the New Daily and the Drum and Insiders doing that? Are they representative of the center, or are they just, simply more center than all of the more well-known and big media outlets that very much seem to lean right? And the one thing that I will close on is up at the top of high quality journalism. If people, like my own personal preferences have always brought me to people like Michael West, in my view, is a great example of independent, impartial journalism at a very high quality level, and he's doing some really, really good work that isn't necessarily driven by the same incentives that we see from some of the other outlets going towards. Not so much driven by the controversial click-through advertising model, and he's working towards more of a subscription model for people who are actually interested in consuming more high-quality journalism. But that's my bias on that.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. I'm just I haven't seen his site before, so I've just got it up on the stream. Sort of scrolling through it. I love that one of the first things he has at the top is a revolving door that shows the revolving doors, Australian politicians and bureaucrats with links to fossil fuels and resource extraction industries. And so I think the idea of the revolving door there is like either moving between those two industries. And that's just sort of, anyway, it was just funny to see that at the top. But it sort of gives you, I guess, a bit of an idea about his criticisms. Yeah, of the way politicians behave. Cool. All right. So I think that's the end of the slides, right?
Yeah.
So let's. So that's. I guess that's just to frame that. That's like the pretense to the next few questions.